Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at Chapter 30 of the Tao Te Ching. And as always, I've got the expert here with me. You've sent over some really cool sources, I've got to say.
I'm glad.
Some different analyses of the chapter, like the original text itself, and then also a lecture from Taoist master Cho Meng Fu.
He's such a great resource.
And he is. He's got such a practical kind of streetwise way of explaining these concepts that I think is really valuable. So I'm really excited to bring that into our conversation.
Yeah.
So we're going to be kind of tackling this idea of leadership and the use of force, especially in war. I think looking at Chapter 30, it seems like Laozi is really kind of questioning that whole approach.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we've got these vivid metaphors that I know we're going to unpack. Thorns and brambles and all that. And even some really interesting comparisons I think we can make to Western philosophy and how things are done in the world today. So to ground ourselves, let's hear it right from the source. This is Chapter 30 in the original Chinese.
Okay.
Whoa, even if you know some Mandarin, that's a mouthful?
Right.
But you know that kind of density is part of what makes classical Chinese so powerful.
It is.
Yeah.
So let's unpack it a little bit here for the listener.
Okay.
What jumps out at me right away is this idea of leadership right from the start.
Yeah.
That very first line, it basically translates to he who assists a ruler by means of the Tao. So from the get-go, we're talking about leadership that's, aligned with the Tao.
Right.
And then right after that comes the contrast. Because Putman does not use military force to dominate the world. So it's almost like he's setting the stage there.
Right away.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's what's so interesting is it's not the typical might makes right kind of approach to leadership that you see so often.
Right.
And to illustrate that further, to kind of drive home this point about the impact of force, he uses this incredibly vivid metaphor, Deidi, Beiti, wherever armies are stationed, thorns and brambles grow.
Yeah.
It's so powerful, that image.
It is. It's a powerful image. It's not just about the physical damage of war either. It's it goes deeper. It's about the lasting scars on society, the disruption of harmony. Thorns and brambles are symbols of hardship, of the natural order being thrown out of balance.
Yeah, and I feel like it's almost like a warning too.
Yeah.
Like if you rely on force, this is what you're going to create.
You're going to create a landscape of thorns and brambles.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And speaking of warnings, this whole concept of proper return that we see in this chapter really grabbed my attention.
Yeah.
Can you explain that a bit more?
Yeah. It's one of the most intriguing ideas in Chapter 30. Actions tend to return.
Okay.
It's not karma in the sense of punishment or anything like that, but it's more like a cause and effect.
Okay.
That's woven into the fabric of the universe.
So it's like those ripple effects you see in nature, right?
Exactly.
You toss a stone in a pond, the waves spread out, they impact the whole environment.
Precisely. Laozi is suggesting that actions, especially those involving force, have consequences that eventually circle back. It's not always immediate or obvious,
Right.
but there's this kind of cosmic accounting going on.
It makes you really think about,
Yeah,
the long-term impact of everything you do.
absolutely.
And to further emphasize this point, he says, after a great army, there must be a bad harvest.
Right.
So even if you achieve a military victory, there's a price to pay.
Yeah.
The disruption, ripples outward, impacts food supplies, social stability, everything.
Everything. Yeah.
So is he advocating for absolute pacifism then? Is he saying force should never be used?
Not necessarily, no.
Oh, no.
He does acknowledge that force might be necessary sometimes,
Okay.
but there are very specific caveats. Look at this line. Sure. The good person achieves results, but does not dare to use them to become strong.
So it's not about completely rejecting force.
Right.
It's about using it judiciously and not letting it corrupt you
Not letting it corrupt you exactly.
or feed your ego.
Right. A leader aligned with the Tao understands that force is a last resort, not a tool for personal gain or aggrandizement.
Okay, so Laozi even goes on to describe what this kind of leader looks like,
He does.
right? The skillful commander. And I think that's what's so interesting is the way he describes that is so different from the typical image of a conquering hero.
Exactly. Instead of boasting and seeking glory, Laozi's skillful commander is incredibly restrained.
Right.
He says, should achieves results but does not boast, does not glorify, does not become arrogant.
It's almost like acting without ego. There's this quiet competence to that kind of leadership.
And that echoes the principle of wu-wei effortless action.
Right.
It's not about passivity, but about acting with a deep understanding of the Tao intervening only when absolutely necessary.
So instead of forcing your will onto the world, you're working in harmony with the natural order.
Exactly.
And wouldn't that be a more sustainable approach to leadership in the long run?
Laozi seems to think, so he's highlighting the dangers of excessive force and urging us to consider the far-reaching consequences of our actions.
Before we get into that, I'm curious, how does this idea of the skillful commander contrast with, say, some of the famous figures we see in Western philosophy?
Oh, that's a great question.
You've got Machiavelli and all those guys who had very different ideas about leadership.
Very different, yeah. Yeah, like Machiavelli's The Prince, for example.
Right.
It's practically a handbook for rulers who want to maintain power by any means necessary, even if it involves, ruthlessness and deception.
Yeah, a very different approach than what we're seeing here.
Very different, yeah.
So it really highlights that difference between, leadership focused on personal gain versus one that seeks harmony and balance for the greater good.
Absolutely.
And to make this even more, relevant to our lives today, we have these insights from Tao master Chu Mengfu, who I think offers this really practical, almost streetwise interpretation of these principles.
His lecture really brings Chapter 30 to life.
It does. And one thing that really stood out to me was that story he tells about the doctor who saves a life using a kind of unconventional method.
Right.
It made me think about unintended consequences.
Yeah, the patient's choking on their own blood.
Right.
So the doctor has to make an incision in their throat, saves their life, but it leaves a visible scar.
Right.
So the doctor's actions were ultimately good.
Yeah.
But they could still be blamed for that scar.
Right. And that goes back to that whole concept of proper return.
It does.
That we were discussing earlier. It's not always, straightforward.
Right.
Sometimes even the best intentions can lead to unexpected outcomes.
Exactly. And the Tao Master uses this story to emphasize that we shouldn't get caught up in seeking recognition or praise for our actions. The moment you focus on getting credit, that's when you invite trouble.
Okay.
It's almost as if attaching yourself to the outcome disrupts the natural flow of the Tao.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So instead, we should just focus on doing the right thing and letting the results speak for themselves.
Exactly. Let go of that need for control.
There's a real humility in that approach.
There is.
And it ties in, I think, beautifully to Laozi's description of the skillful commander who acts decisively but doesn't boast or seek glory.
Right.
It's about doing what needs to be done, not for personal gain, but for the benefit of all.
For the benefit of all, yeah.
And then the Tao Master also brings up this idea of the cyclical nature of things.
Yeah.
He uses that bell curve analogy to illustrate how everything rises, peaks, and then inevitably declines.
Right. It's a pattern we see everywhere.
Everywhere.
In nature, in societies, even in our own lives.
Yeah, absolutely.
And he connects this to the pursuit of power.
Okay.
Suggesting that those who try to cling to dominance actually hasten their own decline. It's like trying to swim against the current.
Right.
Eventually, you're going to get exhausted and swept away.
And he gives this really striking example. He talks about these two nations competing for power. And the one that's constantly trying to maintain its dominance, actually ends up making the other stronger.
Exactly.
By forcing them to fight back even harder.
Yeah. It's like that saying, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger.
Right.
By pushing too hard, you inadvertently create the very resistance you're trying to overcome.
So it backfires.
It backfires, exactly. And he even compares it to cornering a dog.
Oh, wow.
If you give it no space to escape, it has no choice but to attack with everything it's got.
It's such a visceral image.
It is.
And it really drives home that point that trying to control or dominate often backfires. It makes me think about, all the conflicts that are going on in the world today.
Yeah.
And how so much of it seems to stem from this desire for power and control.
And his advice applies just as much to personal relationships as it does to international affairs.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, the more you try to dominate or control someone, the more likely they are to resist.
So the key is to understand that interconnectedness, that cyclical nature of things.
Right.
And to act in a way that promotes harmony rather than trying to force our will onto the world.
Exactly. And he emphasizes this with a really powerful phrase.
Yeah.
Everything needs to be paid for in a certain way.
Ooh, I like that.
It's a reminder that there are always consequences to our actions.
Right.
And that trying to, cheat the system, so to speak, will eventually catch up to us.
Okay, so that brings us to this really crucial question. How do we apply these ancient principles to our modern world?
Right.
How can we live in a way that cultivates peace and happiness, both for ourselves and for society as a whole?
Yeah, that is the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is.
And I think both Laozi and Tao Master Chu-Meng Fu offer some really compelling answers.
Okay.
It all starts with understanding that true peace and happiness, you can't force them.
Right.
They emerge from a different way of being in the world.
So it's like we're being pointed toward this path that's less about conquering and more about, aligning ourselves with the natural flow of things.
Exactly.
But how do we actually do that?
Well, remember that idea of the skillful commander.
Right.
It's not just about leading armies.
Okay.
It's a blueprint for how we approach life in general.
Okay.
It's about acting with intention, but also with restraint, knowing when to push forward and when to step back.
Yeah. So instead of constantly trying to force things to go our way,
Right.
we're learning to work with a natural order.
Yeah.
To find solutions that benefit everyone involved.
Exactly. And this requires us to cultivate a sense of humility,
Yeah.
recognizing that we don't have all the answers.
Right.
And that sometimes the wisest course of action is to let go of control.
It's about, embracing that interconnectedness, realizing that our actions have these ripple effects that extend far beyond ourselves.
Yes, it's almost like shifting our perspective from me to we.
I like that.
Yeah, and that shift can be incredibly liberating.
Okay.
It allows us to move through the world with more ease and grace, to find peace, not through domination, but through understanding and compassion.
It reminds me of something that the Tao Master said about how true strength lies not in conquering others,
Yes.
but in conquering ourselves.
That's such a key point.
It's about mastering our own ego, our desires, our need to control.
Because so much of our unhappiness stems from that internal struggle, that constant striving for something outside of ourselves.
Right.
And Laozi and the Tao Master are suggesting that true fulfillment comes from finding that harmony within.
So when we find that inner peace, it naturally radiates outward.
Exactly.
It impacts our relationships, our communities, the world around us. It's like that ripple effect, but in reverse.
Beautifully put.
So how can we cultivate this inner peace?
It starts with mindfulness.
Okay.
Paying attention to our thoughts, our emotions, our reactions. It's about recognizing when we're caught in those patterns of striving and control.
Right.
And gently guiding ourselves back to a place of balance.
It's also about cultivating gratitude, right?
Yes.
Appreciating the abundance that already exists in our lives.
Absolutely.
Rather than constantly chasing after more.
And finding joy in the simple things, the beauty of nature, the connections we have with others.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing that true happiness doesn't come from external achievements,
Right.
but from a deep sense of inner contentment.
It's a journey, for sure.
It is.
But it's a journey worth taking. And I think Laozi's wisdom, as interpreted through Tao Master Chu-Meng Fu, offers a really powerful roadmap.
It does. And remember, even small steps in this direction can have a profound impact.
That's encouraging.
Yeah, start by incorporating some of these principles into your daily life.
Okay.
Practice mindfulness, cultivate gratitude, find moments of stillness.
And remember, you're not alone on this path.
You're not.
There's a whole community of people who are seeking to live in greater alignment with the Tao, to create a world where peace and harmony prevail.
And as you continue on this journey, keep exploring Chapter 30.
Yeah.
Let its wisdom guide you, challenge you, and inspire you to live a life that's not just successful, but truly fulfilling.
Beautifully said. Until next time, keep diving deep and keep seeking that harmony within yourselves and the world around you. you.